Hello, hello. It's Justin Coletti of SonicScoop, and you have got not just me, but Nic Hard, the man of the hour, or the man of the past hour and a half. If you checked out his masterclass where he took us under the hood of a Snarky Puppy track. Really glad to have you on the channel, Nic. How have you been?
Good, man. How you doing?
Now, this is a rare treat because Nic is one of the only people in the history of MixCon that we've asked to come back to MixCon. He was at, I think, the second ever MixCon back in 2016 or something like that, doing another track, a Snarky Puppy track, where he was really focused on telling us about kind of the mic placement and the recording side of things. And this time, we get to go through the mixing process in even more depth of something you didn't actually record yourself, Nic. These are tracks that were from before your time with Snarky Puppy, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this record was sort of recorded and finished by somebody else, and this was is for a re-release and for the Atmos. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was just mixing.
Well, we got to hear a whole bunch of before and after of your mix compared to the original mix. And I believe that Snarky Puppy got back the rights to this track from their label and have kind of re-released it and wanted to remix it in both stereo and Atmos. And the before and after was really astonishing. It was funny, you were talking about some things you wanted to improve in the mix, and I was listening to the original mix, and I'm like, I don't know, Nic, this sounds pretty good. You're like, oh, there could be a little bit more low end here, a little bit more top end. I'm like, this is a pretty good mix. And then you played the before and after, and I'm like, oh, okay, you definitely can do something with that. So it was really great to hear that transformation. So whoever did it before you did a wonderful job, and then you really leveled it up. And I think one of the big things you were doing there that came up a lot was just how willing you are to bend over backwards to remove some of the bleed and to enhance instruments in ways of getting rid of the bleed in this live situation. And then also, you weren't afraid to do almost no EQ and just rolling off low end spots. And you weren't afraid to do tremendous EQ. Like there's some very steep EQ shapes in there as well. And people commented on both of those. Um, One comment that came in here from, let me see if I can find it. Studio 22 says, I love it when stuff doesn't sound good in solo, but works well in the mix. And that's something that we notice, I think, there. And someone else here said, it's always great to see this is how real pros mix. They don't worry about steep EQs messing with their phase. They just EQ it until it sounds good.
Yeah. I mean, I've sort of come across that a lot. People ask me, "Oh, like, aren't you afraid to with such a steep slope on something?" And honestly, no. I mean, you just listen to it, and if it sounds correct, it's correct.
Yeah.
All the theory in the world isn't really going to help you. So
Yeah, your how your mind thinks something would sound is nothing compared to how things actually sound when you start rolling up your sleeves and tweaking them.
totally, totally.
Yeah.
Loads of times I sort of like have this idea of how something's going to go, and then when I get in there and start doing it, it's like, oh wait, actually no, that's completely wrong, and I have to
For
readjust.
sure. Well, before we get too deep into some of the audience questions, and we have a whole bunch of audience questions here. First of all, let me know in the comments down below how our audio levels are for you guys. If I need to turn Nic up or me down, let us know. But I want to give a brief shout out and thanks to SonarWorks. The reason this one is free to the public is thanks to our sponsors, and the sponsor on this one was SonarWorks Sound ID Reference. Nic has been using their stuff for years upon years, and he is in a room in a house. You are not in a specially constructed from the ground up studio. You're in a room with some acoustic paneling up, and then you have a whole Atmos system in there and great headphones that you're using SonarWorks Sound ID Reference on. Can you tell us when you discovered Sound ID Reference and what do you think the benefits are for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can't remember exactly when it was, but it was sort of 5 or 6 years ago, I think. And I'd sort of made this decision that I wasn't. I basically got fed up of having to rent space in a studio, and deal with all of the stuff, especially in New York City, with all the people that go along with it. Just became sort of tiresome. So I decided that I wanted to be able to mix, virtually anywhere. So I did. One thing I did was teach myself how to mix on headphones and to mix on different monitors and in different spaces. And some of the places I found myself in were, in some cases, completely untreated rooms. And one of the key things that really enabled me to do this was SonarWorks and the ability to calibrate and deal with some of the messiness of these rooms. So I mean, it's basically allowed me to travel around and sort of be more comfortable in different environments. which is really important for me. I mean, I don't like the feeling of being like stuck in one in one place, and only being able to mix on my monitors in my room. You know, when things are properly calibrated, you can kind of do it anywhere,
Yeah.
and you also
And
don't
there's
need to build a custom room necessarily.
Yes. Between headphones, acoustic treatment, and headphones, we really do have, and things like SonarWorks, we really do have the ability to work in more spaces than ever before. I had the same kind of thing when I was living in Brooklyn. I was like, I don't know if I want to live in Brooklyn forever. One of these days, I might want to start a family. I live in New Hampshire now. And just between headphones, headphone correction, room correction, that kind of stuff, the fact that we can do this in spaces that weren't custom built for a minimum of $100,000, to really build out the space is really ushered in a new era in accessibility for this kind of thing.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, with headphones and with SonarWorks, I've mixed an album during a sailing trip. So
Mm.
in the galley of the boat. Um,
Yeah.
then another record was mixed in a completely untreated, except for one carpet on the floor, stone room.
Mm.
Which was incredibly messy, and just, yeah. I mean, without SonarWorks, it probably would not have been doable. But yeah, I mean,
Yep.
I
I hear you.
love
Well,
what
let's
it's
get
doing.
so big thanks to those guys for making this one free to the public. Big thanks to Nick for doing this, and big thanks to Snarky Puppy for being so generous and letting us go into the hood of this track. I want to go through some of the audience questions now. I know we have limited time to do this one. So, young Alexander asks, and I'm not surprised why he asked this, seeing how meticulous you are in here, doing so much by hand and riding the velocities and stuff of kick drums and stripping out, not just doing strip silence, but he asks, how long does a mix like this take? With such a long track, would you charge a premium? So there's a couple of things going on here. The incredible density of tracks here, the incredible amount of cleanup that you're doing, and the incredible length of this track. How long does a mix like this take, and what are some of the practical things there to think about?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, the number of tracks is not as a big a deal as the number of like sections within the song and the length of the song,
Mm-hmm.
because there's sort of so many changing uh, moments during the song. That's kind of what, in places, it's almost like doing a different feeling or a different emotion. But basically, I mean, I think this track took me maybe 4 to 5 hours. So sort of a 3.5 minute song. I mean, these days is taking me 2 to 3 hours,
Yep.
and then I'll put it away and then come back to it and do maybe spend another hour doing revisions, maybe with a client. But yeah, I'd say for these like 4 to 5 hours.
Now, there are people who are at home who are going to be amazed by that because they're still spending 2 to 3 weeks on mixing their song and feeling like they're not finished. Question here, you came from more of an old school studio background where you were trained, by people who were doing this in custom built spaces. Did you ever go through that phase of spending days upon days upon days to make mixes work? Or did the kind of upbringing you had allow you to bypass that to some extent?
Well, when I started, it was still tape, and Pro Tools was in its infancy. And so on bigger budget records, you would have about a day a song to mix it.
Mhm.
But basically, at the end of the 12 hours, you would have to print, and that would be the final thing, because doing a recall was expensive and happened very infrequently,
Yeah.
and would take 4 hours in itself just to get the song back up on the console. And then there were other projects where, I mean, I remember mixing 12 songs in 12 hours.
Yeah.
Um, and I remember the mastering engineer commenting on the last 4 or 5 songs, saying how there was a definite drop off in quality. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that experience of um, I definitely went through a phase of sort of laboring over stuff, and second guessing. And I think now I just try to move quickly and be confident in my decisions,
Yeah.
which I think is the real time saver, and not to like constantly go back and forth on decisions too much.
Well, I can understand why you're so obsessed with good monitoring then, because if you want to be confident in your decisions, you have to first be confident in what you're hearing. And then that allows you to trust yourself in a way that is difficult otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, but in addition to that, there's definitely days where I hear things one way, and then I'll
Mm,
listen to it the next day and be like, oh, actually, it sounds different to me today than it did yesterday,
mhm.
or later that day. So there's a certain amount of that stuff that goes on too. And so if I ever
Yeah.
get into this feeling like I'm unsure about something, or um, get into that second guessing game, I'll actually put it away and
Mm.
stop for the day, and come
Right.
back to it with fresh ears.
Yeah, it has something important to recognize. We ourselves are instruments, and you, as I feel like a relatively athletic person, can definitely understand. You kind of sense what's happening in your body, and I've noticed just caffeine intake. Like if I have, depending on when I have a cup of coffee, like I want to hear things a little bit brighter, or if I'm getting tired, I want to hear things a bit darker. Like it really does have a significant impact on things in that way.
Yeah,
All right,
for
let's try
sure.
to cruise through a few more questions here. Oh, you know what? I want to piggyback on this one and just ask an additional question because someone asked something similar in here, which was about the separation between the mixing process and the editing process. So when you're saying you're trying to get a track like this done in 4 or 5 hours, is that just devoted to mixing and making mix decisions? Or are we also talking about the things where you're muting and getting rid of bleed or reamping or doing these other things? Is that two separate sessions where one is more preparation and one is more mixing? Do you break it up in that way in your mind?
Oftentimes, I mean, I can't remember with this track specifically, but most of the time, I will do as much of the editing as I can before mixing, or have an assistant do some of that stuff in terms of like cleaning up the tom mics and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
But in terms of making the decisions about which mics are on and which mics are off, especially for like all that percussion stuff, that I kind of have to do in during the process of mixing, so I can hear it kind of in relation to the other stuff that's going on. So there's in a track like this, there's a lot of it is happening like while like during that 4 to 5 hours.
Right. Gotcha.
Um,
Some more somewhat related questions here. Stephen Jorison asks, "Did a static? Did you did you do a static mix from scratch, or did you use the previous mix and start from there, or did you kind of do all the gain staging and everything level setting from scratch? So what's the process like there? Because I know some people will ask for sessions from artists saying, "Just give me where you left off, and I'll open up the session and continue the mix from there." And some people will want to kind of do things more from scratch. Were you able to kind of start off where the prior mixer left off, or is that happening from scratch?
no, no, this the I we those sessions were not available.
Mhm.
So this was completely from scratch. So
Mhm.
and I think most of the times I prefer to go from scratch.
Mhm.
I sort of understand it a little bit more if I'm building it from the ground up rather than kind of um, getting into somebody else's way of thinking, if you know what I mean.
Sure. Somewhat related question here about reference tracks. Andre Weiss asks, do you use reference tracks to help hear where you could optimize things, or do you make all the decisions intuitively? And I would add to that, it seems like he's asking, do you reference, while you're mixing? And I guess I would piggyback on that. If you don't reference while you're mixing, do you somehow reference beforehand? And what role does referencing play in the work that you do?
Honestly, I reference very little.
Mhm.
Unless somebody is specifically asking for like they would like this specific snare sound, or something very particular, I tend not to reference, and I just kind of let do it, yeah, I guess do it intuitively, and let my imagination kind of go with it.
Yeah. Now, do you occasionally, in a situation like this where you're trying to beat something, a prior mix, does
Mhm.
referencing the original rough mix that you have, or in this case, not a rough mix, it's a final mix, referencing that to make sure you're beating it, is that useful? Or seeing, what level balances and
Yeah.
which instruments they wanted in relation to, are you checking those things against a rough mix, or in this case, the prior final mix?
Yeah, yeah, I'll definitely do that. I wanna make sure that, what if I'm doing a mix with somebody and there's, yeah, rough mix, I'll definitely check it to see kind of where things are at and make sure, 1, that that it's sounding better,
Yeah.
but 2, yeah, for things like levels of instruments and what they have in the front, sometimes, I might hear something be like, "Oh, like, that guitar should be at the forefront," but then in their rough mix, it's buried, so it is helpful to listen to those and just get a perspective on what people were listening to beforehand.
Right.
Um,
And in
yeah.
this referencing, someone asked about level matching around metric AB you're using to compare your mix to their mix. And they were curious about how particular are you about level matching, because obviously if your mix is so much louder, can get false confidence. But then again, maybe sometimes you want to give yourself a tiny bit of extra confidence so you don't overwork things trying to beat the other guy. Are your thoughts on level matching? Do you have? Are you very particular there?
I will get it. I will get it close.
Mhm.
So yeah, so you're not sort of comparing two different things, but try to have them in the ballpark. So it's yeah, it's honest, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing about level matching, I always like to remind people is it's always going to be imperfect. Once you get two tracks level matched against each other in the chorus, they're not necessarily going to be level matched in the verse, So there's always some compromises that you're going to be making as far as level matching.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
and even just perception of top end and low end and things like
yes.
that is make a big difference. But yeah, I mean, it doesn't need to be scientific. It just
Mhm.
make them sound like they're roughly the same level.
Yep.
You know.
Yep. Don't overthink it too much. Don't get too precious about things. That is one of the great lessons I always learn from people who are really good at this is they, as much as they care, they try not to get too precious. And I think I see that in what you do there, Nick. Stefan Jorison asks, what's your vision on panning the same instruments, for instance, guitars or keyboards that play at the same time? Do you take into account the octave the instruments you're playing in high or low? So, do you have a particular thought process or set of, rules of thumb when it comes to panning and deciding where to put things and what you juxtapose against one another?
I mean, yeah, I mean, generally, I like things to sort of feel balanced. So if there's two things playing like the same thing, I might pan them opposite each other. If one's a keyboard and one's a guitar, I like to feel like it's not heavy on one side with one thing. So if something's playing in a high octave, and then there are two other things that are in octaves below that, maybe the lower things will be left and right, and the higher thing will be in the center. But it is just yeah, I wouldn't say it's really a rule. It's just kind of like what feels right.
Right. Now, this is a question very particular to what Alan here saw. Alan Benjamin writes, may I please ask for the rationale behind separating identical reverb returns based on instruments or instrument groups? I'm not sure if I remember that exact part of the presentation. Does that question make sense to you?
It does, and it doesn't necessarily. There's no real rationale behind that. I just tend to set up mixes with each instrument has its own reverb, and coincidentally, it just happened that it was the same patch and the same reverb on these. So in other songs, they could potentially be all different. But rather
Mhm.
than going back and resending things to all back to the same reverb, it's easiest just to leave it as it is, if that
All
makes
right.
sense. Yeah.
Gabriel Suarez asks, I have a question for Nick. Have you ever tried using VSL MIR Pro? I'm not familiar with this one. VSL MIR Pro instead of Altiverb for placing instruments in a space. Is that a tool you're familiar with?
It's not.
Mirror
I
Pro?
don't. I don't
Maybe
think
it's
it is.
VSL Mirror Pro. Is how you say it?
Mm-hmm.
Not one that I know.
Mm-hmm.
Isomatic asks, how often does Nick reach for mid-side EQ and for what purposes? And sure, you're asked the same questions further on. Do you ever use mid-side in mixing? Does that have a place in mixing for you? Do you see it as more as a mastering tool?
No, no, it actually does. I guess maybe it didn't happen in this song, but sometimes I'll do it um, on, I mean, all kinds of things, even like reverb returns, knocking out mid range in the reverb channel, but only in the mid and leaving it in the sides. Sometimes with some stereo instruments, if there's a lot of like low mid stuff happening in the sides, maybe I'll take that out and leave it in the middle. So it's it happens a little bit. I mean, not a huge amount, but definitely at least like once a song.
Sure. Scholier asks, what's it, not only was it like mixing in Dolby Atmos, but maybe more importantly, where do you see the future of Dolby Atmos? Do you think that this is something that's going to pick up? Are we going to see more consumer adoption of it? What are your thoughts about
This is,
Atmos
I
as a
mean,
format?
this is the big question, and
Yeah.
and I've actually tried not to get too bogged down in it. Um,
Hmm.
the reason I decided to sort of spend the money and do a setup is actually just because I enjoy mixing in it.
Mm,
and
mhm,
it's fun. Um, I will say that I think, in my opinion, the future of this really depends on the binaural render
mhm,
and things like soundbar's ability to reproduce the spatial audio sensation. So
mhm,
if that continues to improve, and then listeners at home have got a soundbar under their TV and actually enjoy listening to music like that, then I think it will be successful. But I mean, at the moment, I still think that listening on a 714 system is amazing, and the
mhm.
binaural is okay.
Right. Yeah, there's no question for anyone who ever hears an actual surround or now Atmos setup that it can sound awesome, can sound amazing. It can be some of the most inspiring listening performances of your life that aren't like actual live performances. The question is whether or not that experience is worth the money to the average person or is, reasonable for the average person. So it sounds like you start by mixing for stereo exclusively. You did a
Yeah.
stereo mix of this. Then you made Atmos choices after. And then there's a binaural render of some of those Atmos choices that give us some of the wraparounds. And when we're wearing headphones, we get some of that sense of now you're putting us in the center of the drummer's perspective with the toms wrapping around us. And you have things are able to go slightly behind or slightly overhead. My question here is if you had to rank these three things, maybe this is a case by case basis, but you have to rank three things. One, listening to the stereo mix. Two, listening to the Atmos mix. My guess is that's going to be your number one. Or three, listening to the binaural render. How do you compare those two things? How much you like your dedicated stereo mix compared to
Mhm.
how much you like the binaural render of the Atmos changes that you made?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really the question: is the stereo mix versus the binaural render?
Yeah.
Because I mean, the surround thing, and especially in a genre like this, is amazing.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I in the beginning, I would have thought like, oh, I definitely prefer the stereo mix to whatever this crazy binaural render thing is. But
Hmm.
it's just different. It's just a
Hmm.
different. It's kind of a different thing, and so I don't mind the binaural render as much as I thought I was going to.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I mean, obviously for me, the full speaker setup is still amazing. And if they can fine tune the binaural or the soundbar thing to be the same kind of experience as it is with 12 speakers, then I think it's definitely here to stay.
Yeah, the soundbar thing is interesting because you could kind of have a binaural experience with a soundbar as long as the soundbar knows where you are. So some of these soundbars now they're coming out with have little cameras on them so they can kind of do head tracking to my understanding. So there's yet another camera spying on you at all times. Siri is now videotaping you as well as just recording all your phone calls. But as long as you don't mind that aspect of it, it's like if you move, it can kind of track you and kind of rebeam the audio is my understanding. But
Yeah.
that will only work for one listener. So it's at that point, like if you're just listening by yourself anyway, it's like maybe you may as well be on headphones and that's going to be a better situation. And then you have the possibility of Atmos in cars, which I think a lot of people are optimistic about. Hey, that's what's going to change things if you're in a
I
car
think
culture.
Mercedes is doing that.
Oh yeah. And of course, at a certain point, like every luxury car might have, Atmos as a standard thing, and that gets people really excited. But it's
Yeah.
like, yes, but is your Honda Civic going to come standard with Atmos? Like, is the average person who's trying to save, a few grand on a car going to have a standard Atmos system in their car? I don't know. It's still going to be a small percentage of people, but a percentage of people who are potentially really interested in music and the kinds of people who like Snarky Puppy are the kinds of people who might be interested in Atmos systems and the kinds of people who might be interested in luxury cars. So for a band like Snarky Puppy, it's perfect. Whether it's the right thing for, Lil Wayne or whoever is a different question.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think price wise, in terms of installing it in cars, I don't see it being that much of a difference because
Hmm.
there's still the same. I mean, cars still come with a whole bunch of speakers in them. I mean, unless you're talking about like super, basic ones that just have the two speakers in the front. But a lot of cars these days have, speakers, 12 speakers in there already.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be an enormous additional cost, but I guess we'll find out. But yeah, I mean this accessibility to the to the consumer end is really what's going to sort of make or break it. But
Well,
for the
one of
moment,
the issues there is when a car system, say a nicer car, does have 12 speakers in it, they are. potentially, split into different bands. So they're like multi-driver systems so that we can get a good sound out of small speakers that we can realistically place. This one's only handling, 100 hertz and to 1K, and this one's only handling 1K and up, etc. So you have 12 speakers, but that is to do the work of two speakers well with small speakers. So all of
Yeah.
a sudden, if you were to try to get that kind of same sound quality with Atmos, now you don't need 12 speakers. You need, like, instead of the base Atmos system, which would be like, I forget if it's 13 or 14 speakers, all of a sudden you'd need 28 speakers or something to do the same kind of thing, possibly.
Yeah, but I also think with the like the technology that's in the sound bars, they're going to be able to sort of emulate some of it as well. So
Yeah. Well, I
with all that,
definitely imagine a whole bunch of happy, snarky puppy fans driving around in Audis and Jaguars and Mercedes with their Atmos systems and checking out this record. And I'm sure that is a fantastic experience. And you drive through Napa Valley or somewhere in Spain or wherever with that kind of situation. It's probably a pretty good day.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, goodness. All right. Moving on from actually, one more question I want to ask you about Atmos. This is a thought that I've been having, which is, you made a remark during your presentation about how once you start to open things up into Atmos, there's just so much more separation available between instruments. And it's like you don't have to necessarily work as hard doing all that, low mid cutting and stuff like that to make things fit, because there's that natural separation of having more speakers. So you could potentially take your stereo mix and EQ it less and have it work in Atmos and leave sounds a bit more untouched, potentially, and have the kind of separation you're looking for. But then that might not fold down to binaural as well as the stereo mix. Do you have thoughts about that and whether EQing would be different in a multi-speaker world versus a two-speaker world?
I mean, I think it could be, but I think if you started doing that, then the transition between the stereo and the Atmos, which ideally you still want them to be similar. You don't want to be completely different animals. So I think if you start doing things like that, they'll start pulling further away from each other.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I'm not sure if that would be a great idea.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no rules about it. So I mean, the Atmos thing could be an entirely, completely different thing
Mhm.
from the stereo. But
Yeah, and there is a possibility to have kind of intelligent playback systems that would say, okay, we can sense that we're on a two-speaker system, so we're going to play not the binaural system, but we'll play the stereo mix. Ah, this listener's on headphones, we'll play the binaural fold down. And okay, they're on an Atmos system, we'll play the full Atmos. Well, with Atmos, I mean, you kind of theoretically it just adapts to the number of outputs that there are, but just full adding that option of, hey, on a two-speaker stereo system, let's play the stereo mix kind of thing. Could be interesting. I'm not sure if that's part of what
it,
Spotify and Apple Music are like
I
doing.
think it should be. I think that's the way it's set up. I think. At
Oh,
least I
I
hope
thought
so.
it was more manual than automatic, but maybe you're right. I am
Mhm.
old these days, Nick, so I'm increasingly out of touch. But hopefully one of us has it right there. All right, moving on to more questions. Let's check out some that are coming in during the live chat. We've hit a half an hour here, and I have to forewarn all of you. Um, I do mastering these days. I'm not recording, so I have not a completely soundproof room, and my wife is about to start teaching piano lessons. So if you hear any kids practicing piano in the background, that's it. But hopefully, this super cardioid Sennheiser 441 microphone will reject all of it, and hopefully we have enough soundproofing to get through some more questions. All right, let's see ones that came in. That one was from Schillier Gabriel. Okay. Isomatic asks, question asked at the end, just in case it didn't come through. Oh, we already got to that one. That was about mid-side EQ. Here we go. Mark K says, thanks for the great masterclass. Did you grow into not being shy about drastic mix decisions like replacing the drums of a world-class drummer? Or have you always been like that? I had a similar question come through my mind when you decide to mute one of the bass clarinet mics because it wasn't doing a lot. You sample augmented or in this case, kind of sample replaced some drums. Is that a relationship? First, did you have to get comfortable with it? And second, did Snarky Puppy have to get comfortable with you doing things like that?
Yeah. I mean, I think well, one to answer the first question, I've always sort of been like that, and
Mhm.
it usually before a mix, I'll tell a client, especially if I haven't worked with them before, that I might try some things in the mix, and just as I hear it, and if they don't like it, that's totally fine, and I'll adjust things, and but I'll, at least in the first pass, I'll do things kind of as I hear it,
Hmm.
and we it's always easy to go backwards. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I've always been like that, and in this instance, uh, I obviously have a relationship with the band, and all of this stuff was approved, so you
Hmm.
know, um, yeah. I mean,
Francesco.
I guess, yeah. The thing is, people get it's. I mean, it sounds like a dirty word when you say sample replace,
Hmm.
and just because that the sound on that microphone is what the drummer played, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good. The playing is
Right.
still amazing,
Yes.
right? And but it's not necessarily integral to the sound of the song either.
Hmm.
And so in this instance, I mean, it really helped a lot to clear up
Yeah.
space and to allow other things to sound better. So it's sort of like a little deal, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, you're making, in one sense, you're making a compromise on a theoretical level, but what you're ultimately doing is saying, okay, the most important thing is, are we getting the playing that they did to come across to the end listener in all of its detail? And one way to do that would be to have the exact instrument they played clouded over, and all these instruments clouded over multiple times by all this bleed. Or what if we could take his exact performance, just as you have, and kind of velocity map it so that we really get the nuances of the performance still, and do that in a way that now allows us to hear the detail, not only of that instrument, but also of every single other instrument that it might be clouding? Do we get a
Yeah,
more authentic and full presentation of what they were really trying to play and communicate to the audience? And the answer might be yes. And
I
in this
mean,
case, it probably was yes.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Good. So those are, goals you have to balance against one another. And it's funny too, because ultimately when we're hearing the drummer play the drum, we're not really hearing the drummer play the drum. We're hearing vibrations that went through the air and then vibrated a capsaw on a mic like this and turned into electrical signal. It's already so many steps removed from what actually happened physically in the space. You know, it's like, what's another step, as long as it is united ultimately to what the artist was trying to express, and helping what they were trying to express kind of come across.
yeah, and I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you can't tell, um,
Yeah.
with the end product, you can't tell that it was sound replaced. That's kind of the goal.
Yeah.
Um,
W
and I
Well, I
think in
also
this case,
think that, people maybe develop biases because they've either heard a lot of bad sound replacement, or more likely, they've done bad sound replacement because they've done this exact thing where it's like they have one kick sample, and no matter what the level of the kick playing, is, you get the same exact thing being triggered, and they're like, "This sounds terrible. Sample replacement must be awful." And it's like, is sample replacement awful? Or is half-hearted, half-assed sound sample replacement awful?
yeah, I mean, and another thing is it also depends on the genre, and
Yes.
in a more like pop scenario, rock scenario, like doing it the very basic way,
Yes.
oftentimes is with zero dynamics, can
100.
actually
Percent.
be amazing.
Yeah.
Um,
It still depends though on the section to section basis, because you could have the rock song where you have the big rock chorus and you want a perfectly precise sample, that entire chorus, but for the quieter bridge section, you want a different one sample that's consistent the whole way
yeah,
through. So there's
yeah,
still that
sure,
aspect to it. But yes, I hear what
definitely,
you're saying. There are absolutely genres in which the goal is to make the thing more robotic, and people will bend over backwards doing everything except for sample replacing or sample augmenting to try to get that robotic feel. They'll say, "I'm just not
yeah.
compressing enough. I'm just not EQing enough. I'm just not gating enough." And they won't do that one thing of like, what if you just augmented it with a sample?
Right. And I mean, to me, the most important thing here is the overall song,
Yes.
and the feeling and the emotion of the song that you get. It's not, does the drummer's kick drum sound like the 13 ply birch or maple, whatever.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
It's that stuff is sort of irrelevant if it's not suiting the song. So like a lot of the times in making the choice on what the sample is or how whether I'm blending it with the original, it's to me it's a decision based on what the overall sonic shape of the song is and the feeling that is going to come from it. So it's
Yeah,
sort of not being too precious about techniques and things like that.
100%. Now I can hear how quiet the piano playing is back there. I doubt you're even hearing it through your speakers there. I doubt any of these folks are. So we'll keep trucking through and go through a few more questions. Let's see here. This is an answer where I think you're going to, well, maybe you'll say yes. Francesco asks, can you recommend a good European acoustician to improve the acoustics of home studios? Now that you're in Spain, do you have any contacts out there who you'd point people to?
Um, I think I do, but I'll have to look up the name. The name.
Okay.
I've been told there's a couple of good ones in Germany.
All right.
Um, I think there is a guy here in Spain, but I don't know him personally, and I can't remember his name.
Gotcha.
But
Francesco, if you want to be so bold, I'm sure you can look up Nick on his website and find his contact page. If people want to
yeah,
find more out about you, where are the best places to look you up and follow what you're doing?
I have no idea. I guess I guess
Is there a
I mean
nickhard.com somewhere?
there is a nickhard.com somewhere, which hasn't been updated in a long time, and then
Yeah.
Instagram and stuff like that. But
Yep.
yeah,
Dude, I do stuff on the internet for a living, and I don't think my personal website has been updated since like 2012. I'm not sure. All
yeah.
right. Let's keep tracking here. Oh, here's an interesting one. Gabriel Suarez asks, Nick, do you use SonarWorks to adjust only the low end and low mids, or do you use it to adjust the whole frequency spectrum?
No, it's everything. I just run
Mhm.
with the calibration I mean, like the most simple thing.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I've especially with the phase adjustment and stuff. I think it's really yeah, it works really well like that.
Yeah, I like that they have the option now to zero it in on a particular part of the frequency spectrum. I could imagine that being useful in cases where, like, you've already learned your system and you kind of like know how it sounds, but you're like, I just know the low end could be better in here. Let me try SonarWorks, and then you apply it just to the low end, and now you don't have to relearn your top end, and you only have to relearn your low end. Maybe there's some potential benefit there. So I think it's a cool feature. But yeah, I think most people I talk to are using it like you across the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it changes the sound of your speakers and whatnot, but I don't know. Just I just found when doing it like that, it works for me. So
Mm. This is I'm not sure if I understand this question from Carola, but I'll try to ask it. I was participating at a mix master session at the Alliance of Music in Stockholm, Sweden. Legendary mix master folks said that they wouldn't bother to invest in Atmos equipment, nor mix even for Atmos. Why not? So I don't know if that's a specific question for you. I think it's a question for the world. She seems interested in Atmos, and um, would you give a pitch to people who are disinterested in it as to why they should be interested in it?
yeah, I mean, so basically, I installed the system about a year ago, and it was after I did this my first Atmos mixing session. And before that, I have to say I was very skeptical. After
Mhm.
like seeing 5.1 sort of come and go, and without much interest, I was like, oh, what good is it? I don't necessarily want like guitars flying around my head or things like that. But when I mixed Snarky Puppy's Empire Central with Fab, um, after about an hour of doing it, it was just fun.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what sold me on it. I enjoy doing it. And
Mhm.
so it's not this big question of like we were talking about earlier, like the longevity of it or anything. It's just a pleasurable experience. And also playing stuff for playing people's records for them in Atmos, and watching them listen to it in that format is great. So I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's really, yeah. I mean, I've definitely sort of switched sides, and it's just because of enjoyment.
Mhm. Yeah. Great answer. All right. Um, Tanner by the Sea, Nick's interface is the same as that Neumann, right? Question mark. I'm not sure if I know what he's saying there. It was the
Yeah,
go ahead,
I
man.
do. Basically, I think Neumann has bought merging and
Gotcha.
have slightly tweaked the interface, whereas this one's Ethernet based. I think the Neumann one is Thunderbolt. And then they've I don't know if the software is different, but yeah, basically it was slightly adapted technology.
Gotcha. So if someone was going to buy the same interface you own today, it would be a Neumann interface.
I think merging is still selling this interface.
Ah,
And in order to do the Atmos thing, I would think it would have to be this because there's another component to it as well that has more outputs. Whereas I think the Neumann one, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that it's just a sort of um, a stereo thing.
gotcha. All right. All right. Let's keep going. I think a few more to get through here. Alan, thanks you for the feedback on his question. Archetype says YouTube is popping up ads on a live stream. Yeah, I turn on the ad thing because increasingly we're worried that like if you don't turn on ads, that YouTube won't show your videos to as many people because they're like, why feed this video that we're not getting paid for instead of feeding this video? So when we first started the channel, we didn't run ads on anything. Like our first video that Bob Power had up that had like 1.5 million views, we made literally $0 in ads off. And we just kept ads off because we want people to be able to see it. And it's like 1.5 million views. If you get to know the world of YouTube, 1.5 million views will get you like $5,000, which, I mean, that's some money, but over the grand scheme of like how many views a channel gets. And honestly, with our MixCon videos now, SonicScoop doesn't get any money from MixCon videos. It all goes to the artist. So Snarky Puppy will get paid for Nic's video. I mean, that's how it works with Content ID. The actual ad revenue will all go to the artists. And we can reach out to artists and say, hey, could you whitelist our channel so it runs ad free? But we choose not to do that because it's like, I don't know. I think it's kind of cool that the artists will get paid any of the money for the video. And then we'll just work with a sponsor to make sure that the expenses of putting the video together get covered. And for us, that's a win for everybody. So I apologize if you get interrupted by an ad. I do make sure that they are all skippable ads so that you'll never be bumped off the stream for more than 5 seconds, and it shouldn't happen more than once every 18 minutes or so. All right. Paul liked your idea of mid-side on reverb. Ben said, not a question, but just want to say that Nic's mixing room has a great clean style to it. Looks really good. Yeah, that was something that I noticed. It does have, it's an uncluttered space, and there isn't like a crazy amount of acoustic treatment there. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts about designing the room and all that?
Yeah, basically, I mean, it is still a work in progress. And I mean, for the first like 6 months I was in here, there was no acoustic treatment put up. There's still a handful of things that would like to do in terms of more panels. I don't know. There's a few areas that you can't really see, but yeah, I mean, again, it's sort of I like not having to have this fully developed room. And not have, or certainly not like a purpose built thing. But yeah, I can't say that there's really like a solid reason behind it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Corolla asks, do you have to be extra mindful of EQ changes regarding phase relationships and interference patterns while creating immersive audio mixes in Dolby Atmos?
I don't think so. And I don't. I mean, or at least I don't pay attention to it. Again, it's just that kind of thing of one. This is also based on the stereo mix, so just I mean, I'm panning things out, and if it sounds okay, then it sounds okay.
Yeah.
You know.
We hinted at this early on. We actually kind of went into this topic, but one thing I just want to throw out there is I think that a lot of people misunderstand the idea of phase. And I always love to tell this to people who haven't heard it because I think it's useful to know. A lot of people misunderstand phase and they think that if you EQ a sound, you get EQ plus this nasty byproduct called phase. And that's not how EQ works. The way EQ works is you mess with the phase of the signal, and the byproduct of that is the EQ that you were trying to get. Now, it does get a little bit funnier when you're in a multi-channel system. Like theoretically, if you're EQing the top and bottom of a snare mic separately, they have enough in common that if you're making changes to the phase of the bottom mic and therefore getting EQ, that there is a phase relationship difference that happens between the bottom mic and the top mic. But all that means is you just have to listen to the EQ instead of look at what the numbers say with your eyes. And as long as you're ultimately listening to the sound of it, like those phase byproducts are just like yet another byproduct of the EQ. And as long as you're listening rather than looking, it's not like you'll get this weird comb filtery effect and your sound will be ruined. It's just that the EQ effect that you get with multi-channel audio, when you EQ one of those multiple channels, it also has a little bit of an influence on how those other channels sound. So listen,
Yeah, and
that's my
I
take
don't
on
know
it.
that it gets any more different with the multi-channel thing. I mean, obviously, sometimes you have things now coming out of several speakers at once, but if the room is tuned correctly, um,
Yeah.
and the speakers are with the correct delays and stuff, it should be fine.
Yeah. Well, if anything, it makes it a little bit easier because that phase idea would be less of an issue if you pan the two signals that are related to each other far out left and right. And the difference would be slightly greater when they get summed down to mono. So if you
Sure.
can now spread these different EQs out to so many different speakers, it should be even less of an issue, even on a theoretical basis. But
Yeah.
enough of us being nerds. Let's go into some more audio questions here. Let's see. Eros and Paul have related questions. Eros says, is outboard gear necessary for an industry standard mix? If so, which gear would you go through for a mix? And Paul says, that's a good question. Was this all done in the box? I can answer the second one. Yes, this mix was all done in the box. And can you answer that first one? Is outboard gear necessary? And if so, what gear would you go with? So why did you go to mixing in the box? Do you think you can mix in the box? Clearly the answer is yes. And if you had to have hardware, do you have any desire to have hardware? And if so, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, my answer is that you do not need any hardware, and that for me, the value of being able to recall instantly, weeks or months or hours from the time of the mix is worth more than any piece of analog gear.
100%.
And yeah, if you I mean, there was a time where I was sort of bussing things down on drums and bass would go through an outboard compressor, and keys would go through an outboard compressor, and then there'd be a mix bus compressor. But it's I've just found it's just so much better to be able to recall something instantly, and the sort of the value that you get from a piece of analog gear is just it's just not worth it. If you sit and you A B, an LA2A in the box and one out of the box, the one out of the box is going to sound better. But in context of within a mix, I mean, it just makes so little of a difference these days. Like the tech has gotten so good, and just that ability to recall instantly is invaluable. I mean, and this comes back to this like decision making um, process and how to do things quickly. If you're I don't know. I find if, like I said, if I get stuck and I start second guessing things, I like to put it away and open it back up again. And if
Yeah.
if I'm mixing a couple of records at the same time, I don't want to have to like recall several bits of gear just to make a small decision. So for
Yeah.
me,
I'm
that
all digital for the same reasons. However, I'm going to throw some caveats out there, and I'm going to throw out a funny idea that just occurred to me, which is that a lot of producers and engineers say, man, Atmos, they're just trying to screw us little guys. They're going to make it mandatory to have everything be in Atmos, and we can't all afford these, multi-thousand-dollar speaker setups. And it's like, hold on. If you all just stopped buying preamps and hardware compressors and EQs for like a year, you could probably get the multi-speaker setup. So that's one possible thing there.
in
You want to
addition,
pick
you can
go
also just mix in Atmos on headphones.
right. That is
I don't
true.
I don't think there's anything wrong with mixing in the binaural thing. I mean, I think it would take some of the fun out of it for me, but I think
Yes.
that you could do an Atmos mix in headphones, and it would be. I mean, it should be checked on speakers maybe once, but you could have somebody else do that.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, that was going to be a question that I had is, have you ever been in that process where you're like, okay, I'm on the boat cruise this month and I'm mixing an album in Atmos. I'm going to do it pretty much all in my headphones. And then at the end of the mix process, just check it on speakers. Like, have you gone through that yourself and found that it's worked?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like the record that I did on the sailboat was fine,
Yep.
and yeah.
And you did the surround version there as well.
Oh no, sorry, not Atmos, just stereo with that. So
Gotcha.
I haven't done anything exclusively in Atmos on headphones yet.
That's the question. Well,
Uh,
the next time you do like a vacation traveling around the world mix, see if you can do an Atmos mix for one of the songs on headphones. Take it back to your home setup and let me know how it turns out. I'd be really curious because I know
I
that you're confident that you could, and I don't doubt you, but I would just love to hear your experience if you ever go through that process.
the first thing that I did in this house, I began on headphones because
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't received all of the the hardware to hang the speakers or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I started the thing, and then so I began it, but then finished it on the speakers, but it didn't go all the way to the end.
Yep.
But yeah,
Gotcha.
I don't doubt that you could do it.
Yep. The last couple things I would just say on the hardware front from the perspective that we're talking about, because I know some people listening to this channel right now like hardware and do great work with it. And I've even interviewed someone recently, Joe Wanasek, who switched from doing digital his whole life to now getting a console. And he's like, I love this. I'm never going back. And he was talking about how simple the recalls were for him. And it really comes down to printing so much of what he's doing. So the recall is, and I was talking to Joel Hamilton, who you might know recently, and he's doing a
Yeah.
MixCon presentation. His big thing for recall again is just printing a lot of stuff, so you can still recall things up like at unity gain, and you're starting from there. So if you are going to do analog, that's probably the way to do it. Is do it in a way where recall is easy. That's number one. But the
Yeah.
last thing I would quickly say in defense of the analog people is a lot of them will give the same reason that you give for liking mixing in Atmos, which is that's fun. It's more enjoyable. They feel more connected
Yeah.
to the process, more inspired. And if that's a big factor for you, then I don't think anyone should tell you not to.
Oh yeah. I mean, the mixing with analog gear is super fun. I mean, that's how I started, and
Yep.
it was all analog and no computers. And I did a record, I think not this past summer, but the summer before, that was straight to tape and straight mixing down to quarter inch. So I never saw the thing. One of the other reasons that I like working in the box, and this is sort of more on the recording and production end, is just the ability to get through ideas quickly.
Mm,
And I think it sort of removes or it makes the process faster. So I can execute 50 ideas of different sounds of things in a couple of minutes, whereas in the analog world it might take me a much longer time.
mhm.
So
Understood.
it kind of get in the way of creativity.
Well, we're coming up close to an hour here, so I want to get through maybe lightning round of the last few questions. I really appreciate the time you've taken with us today, and I want to just go through a couple more here real quick and get you out of here. But thank you again so much for the masterclass. Thank you guys for hanging out with us and asking the questions. Thanks to SonarWorks for making this happen, and thanks to Snarky Poppy for letting us hear the track. If you haven't already, please go to the MixCon Mega Giveaway. I put a link there in the beginning of this chat and in the description where you can win up to $10,000 worth of free gear with 3 chances to win. So, last couple of lightning round questions here. Steve asks, is it a good idea to apply a transient plugin on every track before EQing during mixing?
I'm not sure why you would do that, but
Yep.
I mean, if it's working for you, then that's it could be cool.
Sure. That was an extremely diplomatic answer. That was very good. All right. Carla says the future with Atmos is cars, of course. Um, Dolby Atmos will be in kitchens, gaming, VR, streaming, and she believes it's going to be an experience, something that we're all going to experience more regularly. All right, let's
Cool.
keep on going through here. Jaum, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, asks if you use the blend knob on your SonarWorks. I'm guessing there that the answer is no. That's just
Yep.
kind of straight up.
Yep.
Oh, here's a good question. Stefan asks, I've seen Snarky Puppy play with 2 drummers. How do you mix that? And do you auto align the tracks? I guess those are 2 separate questions. How do you mix 2 drummers? And do you use things like auto align, I guess, on any individual drum kit?
So the first studio album I did with Snarky Puppy, there were actually three, or on the studio albums that we've done, there are two or three drummers.
Mm-hmm.
And in some instances, they're playing at the same time, and sometimes they're splitting the parts up into one guy will be playing like kick and snare, another guy will be playing cymbals. Other times it's like full, full kit stuff from both people. And I mean, I guess the answer is, well, there's no time correction between the two drummers, because all of these guys are good enough that they don't need to be corrected with this stuff. They're tight with each other. In some instances, I'll pan one kit left, one kit right. Other times, they're right on top of each other. So it just sort of that'll depend on the song and what the feeling should be.
All right. Kevin asks, how do you get complex synths to not take over the mix?
Well, I think it not being too precious with the sound of the synth itself, and EQing it in relation to the other things. It's really easy to take sort of the sound of the synth that covers the whole frequency spectrum and just think, oh, I'm going to make this sound amazing in solo. But yeah, not being too precious about. I mean, cut low end off of it, cut high end off of it. Yeah, and don't use it straight up as it is.
Yeah. There is, the longer I do this, the more I discover how much high cut and low cut filters can be useful, or like significant shelves. Like you don't necessarily need anything but the mid range on some instruments in very dense mixes. And I noticed, you doing that with your reverb returns. And one of the things that I wanted to shout to the heavens when I first saw you bring up your reverbs was like, yes, EQ your reverb returns, people, because you had this, like, I think it was like a xylophone sound where you're cutting off almost all the low end, but then a ton of top end. And it really allows you to get away with more reverb than you could otherwise without it sounding amateurish and taking over and getting rid of, in that case, you said the clack of the instrument, and just
Mhm.
shaving off way more high end than most new mixers would think to do. I think is a big thing that a lot of people don't recognize. And you can potentially treat synths the same way, find out where they need to live. You could boost that area, or you could take away everything else. And, you
Totally.
know, don't be afraid to get rid of the things that you don't need in a sound. And I think that harkens back to one of the comments that came early on, which was always great to see when a sound is less good in solo, but better in the mix. Because, yeah, it's not necessarily about making that sound better. It could be about making everything else around it sound better. And that's
It's
why you're
it's all
EQing that
about
sound.
the relationship. It's all about the
Yeah,
relationship to things and
so
masking
true.
and stuff.
Yeah, it's like if your synth is masking your vocal and your bass, you could try to find the right frequency in your vocal and bass to kind of poke through above the synth, or it's like just get rid of a ton of stuff on the synth, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
All right. I want to give a little bit of love to the analog lovers in here. Benj writes, often the guys mixing with analog still are leaving stuff patched to particular channels and using plugins to adjust on the way into the hardware, and typically leaving the hardware set statically. So yeah, I mean, that
Mm.
is, Chris Lord Alge will tell you he never, moves a knob on any of his compressors. And when I was talking to Joel Wanasek, who recently transitioned to analog, that's kind of how he approaches things. He has things set up, runs everything through them, but does a lot of the mix in the box.
But these guys kind of mix on a sailboat. So
That's true. They cannot mix on a sailboat. I remember I asked Glenn Schick, who is mastering using nothing but headphones and plugins. And I gave him the fun question. It's like, yes, you can master using nothing but headphones. And I have done it. I've done it on trips. But I said, isn't it more fun to mix on speakers? And he
yeah,
said, you know what? You're probably right. It is. But you know what else is fun? Skinny dipping. And I don't plan on doing it.
yeah,
You know, I was like, all right, okay, fair enough, fair enough.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Studio 22 says, man, I keep my analog setup, just building a new desk for it. I'll buy more when others go in the box.
Yeah.
So we'll give love to the analog folks. Last question here, and then we'll let you go, is from Donna J, who says, do you think that listening to music on earphones and headphones over long periods of time is harmful to mixing engineers' hearing abilities?
Well, that'd be a question for Doctor. But I mean, I'm assuming if you're listening really loud, you can make yourself deaf with those
You're a
things.
mix doctor, Nick. You should know these things.
Yeah.
Well, how about the answer is we'll find out in 30 years. Ask us again when we're older, and if we can hear you, we'll let you know.
What? No, just kidding.
Right. Well, I think that's a good way to end it, Nic. Thank you for hanging out with us here for almost an hour for this Q&A and answering all the great audience questions. Thank you again to SonarWorks Sound ID Reference. Check it out. Go over to sonarworks.com. You can try it out for free. Check out the band Snarky Puppy. They're awesome. And type Nic Hard into your internet machine and follow him on the things. He has an Instagram. He has a website from 1984, apparently, and all the good stuff. Thanks again for being here, Nic. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.